Crew denies an old veteran access on plane, not knowing the undercover owner. Owner was watching Keanu Reeves shuffle toward the boarding gate, his cane tapping softly on the polished airport floor. His faded army jacket hung loosely on his lean frame, the patches worn from years of use and memories. Beneath his cap, dark, slightly graying strands of hair framed his weathered face, and his eyes, though tired, held a glimmer of quiet pride. It wasn't a big deal for him flying to Seattle. The journey was for a ceremony honoring his old military unit. Keanu didn't like the fuss, but he figured it was important to show up. After all, not many of his comrades were still around to attend. The gate agent, a young woman with a name tag that read Samantha, glanced at Keanu as he handed her his boarding pass. Her smile faltered for a moment before she plastered it back on. "Sir," she said, her voice polite but firm, "this ticket is invalid for this flight." Keanu furrowed his brows. "That can't be right. I bought it a month ago." Samantha's eyes flickered with impatience. She scanned the pass again, then shook her head. "I'm sorry, but we've already assigned that seat to another passenger. You'll have to wait here while we sort this out." Keanu sighed. He'd flown plenty of times before, and things like this happen. "All right," he said, stepping to the side as people streamed past him into the jet bridge. Behind Keanu, a man in his mid-30s leaned against a nearby pillar, watching the interaction. Clad in a plain black hoodie and jeans, Keanu Reeves didn't look like much, just another passenger waiting for his flight. But Keanu wasn't just another traveler. He was the owner of Reeves Aviation, the airline Keanu was attempting to board. Keanu often flew under the radar, blending in with passengers to observe how his staff treated them. Keanu's sharp eyes narrowed as he watched Samantha exchange a few quiet words with a coworker. He caught snippets of the conversation. "Looks like it's overbooked. He'll probably cause a scene. Shouldn't let him on. It'll be easier." Keanu's jaw tightened. He wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but something about the way they spoke didn't sit right with him. His focus returned to Keanu, who stood patiently at the side, his cane trembling slightly under the weight of his grip. Minutes turned into 10, then 15. Other passengers boarded, some casting sympathetic glances at Keanu, while others barely noticed him. Samantha returned, her expression carefully neutral. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reeves, but it looks like there's no seat for you on this flight," she said. Keanu blinked. "What do you mean, no seat? I paid for my ticket. I have somewhere I need to be." "I understand, sir, but the flight is overbooked, and we can't accommodate you." Keanu's ears perked up. He stepped closer, pretending to check his phone as he eavesdropped. Samantha's tone had shifted, no longer polite but dismissive, as though she wanted Keanu to give up and walk away. Keanu straightened his posture, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I just want the seat I paid for." A smirk played on Samantha's lips. "Sir, let's not make this difficult. I'm sure we can rebook you on a flight tomorrow." Keanu opened his mouth to respond, but stopped when he noticed a small boy tugging on his mother's sleeve nearby. The boy pointed at Keanu's jacket and whispered something about the medals pinned to it. The mother gave Keanu a tight smile before hurrying her son along, clearly uncomfortable. Keanu Reeves couldn't stand it any longer. He stepped forward, his voice calm but authoritative. "Excuse me," he said. "What seems to be the problem here?" Samantha looked startled, her professional mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "Oh, no problem. We're just assisting this passenger." "Assisting him by denying his seat?" Keanu asked, raising an eyebrow. Keanu glanced at Keanu, surprised by the stranger's intervention. "It's all right, son," he said softly. But Keanu Reeves wasn't about to let this slide. "No, it's not all right," he replied, his voice steady but firm. "This man served his country, and he deserves better than this." Samantha's face flushed as she realized the gravity of the situation. Keanu Reeves, the owner of the airline, was standing right in front of her, and she had just denied a veteran his rightful seat. I'm so sorry, sir," she stammered. "Let me fix this immediately." Keanu Reeves nodded, his expression softening. "See that you do. And remember, every passenger deserves respect, especially those who have given so much for us." With that, Keanu Reeves turned to Keanu, offering a warm smile. "Thank you for your service, sir. Let's get you on that flight." Keanu nodded, a quiet gratitude in his eyes. As he boarded the plane, he couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of pride, not just for his service, but for the kindness of strangers who still cared. And Keanu Reeves? He simply blended back into the crowd, content knowing he'd made a difference, even if no one else would ever know. "I'll figure it out," Keanu Reeves has said, ignoring Harold's attempt to downplay the situation. "He has a valid ticket, doesn't he?" Samantha hesitated. "Yes, but..." "Then he should be allowed to board," Keanu's tone hardened. "Overbooking is the airline's mistake, not his." Samantha flushed. "I'll see what I can do," she said quickly, turning away to confer with another employee. Keanu turned to Harold, offering a small smile. "I'm Keanu. Mind if I stick around to make sure they don't give you the runaround? Harold chuckled softly. Suit yourself. Appreciate it. As the minutes ticked by, Keanu struck up a casual conversation with Harold. He learned that Harold had served in the army during the Korean War and that he was traveling to reunite with a dwindling number of his unit for an awards ceremony. Harold spoke humbly, glossing over the details of his service, but Keanu could sense the depth of his experiences. Eventually, Samantha returned, her expression sour. We've managed to find a seat for you, sir, but it's not in economy. It's in the last row, next to the restroom. Harold's shoulders slumped slightly, but he nodded. That'll do. Keanu, however, wasn't satisfied. That's unacceptable. He paid for a specific seat. Samantha's forced smile returned. It's the best we can do. Keanu's gaze sharpened. He wanted to reveal who he was, to call out Samantha's behavior right then and there, but something held him back. There was more to this situation, he could feel it, and he wanted to see how it played out. As Harold made his way toward the plane, Keanu followed, his mind racing. There was something about Harold that nagged at him, a feeling he couldn't quite place. It wasn't until Harold stumbled slightly, dropping his small duffel bag, that Keanu saw it. A glint of metal spilled out of the bag. A metal, polished but clearly old. Keanu's heart skipped a beat as he bent down to help Harold. When he picked up the metal, his breath caught. The inscription on it was unmistakable. He'd seen that metal before, on the mantelpiece of his late grandfather, who had often told stories of his time in the war. Keanu's hands trembled as he handed the metal back to Harold, his mind swirling with questions. Could it be possible? Could this man, this humble, quiet veteran, be the same Harold Bennett his grandfather had spoken of so fondly? Keanu didn't know yet, but he was determined to find out. He followed Harold down the aisle, his thoughts racing. His grandfather, Richard Reeves, had spoken often of his time in Korea, sharing stories of courage, camaraderie, and the men who had shaped him. One name came up more than most, Harold Bennett. He had described Harold as a man of unshakable integrity, a soldier who had saved lives and made sacrifices beyond what most could comprehend. And now here he was, older, frailer, and being treated as an inconvenience by his own airline staff. Harold took his seat in the cramped last row near the restroom, the faint hum of the engines masking Keanu's footsteps as he stopped a few rows ahead. He pretended to check his phone, his thoughts still on the metal. It was identical to the one his grandfather used to show him, the Distinguished Service Cross. Few men earned such an honor, and even fewer wore it as humbly as Harold had. Keanu had to know more. The flight attendants began their pre-flight checks, and Samantha's curt voice floated over the intercom, instructing passengers to prepare for takeoff. Keanu decided to wait. He wasn't about to let the moment slip, but he also didn't want to overwhelm Harold. For now, he would observe and piece things together. As the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, the faint sound of coughs and murmurs filled the cabin. Harold leaned back in his seat, eyes closed, his hand resting on the duffel bag at his feet. Keanu took a deep breath, stood up, and casually made his way toward the back. He pretended to stretch near the restroom before leaning toward Harold. Mind if I sit here for a bit? Keanu asked, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. Harold opened his eyes, squinting slightly before nodding. Sure, young man. Long as you don't mind the smell back here, he joked, gesturing to the nearby restroom. Keanu chuckled as he sat down, his mind already racing with how to broach the subject of the metal and the stories his grandfather had told. For now, though, he simply smiled and settled in, ready to listen. I've had worse, Harold said after a beat. He added, that's an impressive medal you've got there. Distinguished Service Cross, right? Harold's eyes flickered with surprise. He nodded, his fingers instinctively brushing the metal through the fabric of his bag. Not many recognize that these days. My grandfather had one, Keanu said, keeping his tone conversational. He used to tell me stories about the men he served with, said they were the real heroes. Harold gave a soft, knowing smile. Your grandfather must have been one of them then. Keanu paused, choosing his words carefully. He talked a lot about someone named Harold Bennett, said he wouldn't be alive if it weren't for him. The old man's expression changed. His smile faded, replaced by something deeper, a mix of pride and sadness. Richard Taylor, Harold murmured. I remember him. Fine soldier, a good man. Keanu's chest tightened. That was my grandfather. Harold turned to look at Keanu fully, his gaze sharpening despite his age. You're Richard's grandson? Keanu nodded, feeling a wave of emotion he hadn't expected. He used to tell me about the time you saved his life, he said. He owed you everything. Harold's lips pressed into a thin line, and he looked down at his hands. Your grandfather was braver than he gave himself credit for. He kept our unit together when everything fell apart. We lost a lot of good men out there. Keanu didn't respond immediately, letting the weight of Harold's words settle. After a moment, he asked, why didn't he ever tell me what you did? Harold chuckled, though there was no humor in it. Men like your grandfather didn't dwell on the past. They didn't want their families to carry the burden. Besides, what I did, it was just part of the job. Keanu shook his head. Not everyone would have done it. Harold shrugged, maybe, but it's not something I like to dwell on. Their conversation was interrupted by Samantha, who approached with a tight smile. Sir, I need you to return to your seat, she said to Keanu, and her tone clipped. Keanu met her gaze evenly. I'm fine here, thanks. Samantha's jaw tightened. It's against policy to block the aisle near the restrooms for too long. Keanu raised an eyebrow. I'm sitting in an empty seat, not blocking anything. Harold cleared his throat. It's all right, son. Don't cause trouble on my account. Keanu bit back a retort and stood. I'll be back, he said quietly to Harold before giving Samantha a pointed look as he returned to his seat. Back in his row, Keanu's mind raced. He had heard enough to confirm what he suspected. This man was the same Harold Bennett his grandfather had revered. But there was something else beneath the surface, something Harold wasn't saying. Keanu could feel it in the pauses and the way Harold avoided talking about his own actions. The man was carrying a burden, and Keanu was determined to understand it. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his emails until he found what he was looking for. A message from his operations manager about the company's new veteran outreach initiative. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here was one of the greatest veterans he'd ever met, and his own airline had treated him like a problem to be ignored. Keanu leaned back, a plan forming in his mind. He wasn't just going to apologize to Harold, he was going to make things right. As the plane began its descent, Keanu returned to Harold's seat, ignoring the glances from the flight attendants. He crouched beside the old man and spoke quietly. When we land, can I buy you a cup of coffee? There's something I want to share with you. Harold raised an eyebrow but nodded. All right, son. I suppose I've got time, Harold said after a beat. Andrew smiled, relief washing over him. The rest of the passengers were too busy preparing for arrival to notice the exchange. But Andrew knew this was just the beginning. He didn't fully understand why, but he felt a deep responsibility to this man, not just for what Harold had done for his grandfather, but for everything he represented. As the plane touched down and the cabin filled with the usual flurry of activity, Andrew stayed close to Harold, silently vowing that by the time the day was over, Harold Bennett would get the respect he deserved. The airport was a hive of movement and noise, but Harold and Andrew found a quiet corner in the small cafe near the baggage claim. Harold sat down slowly, his cane propped against the table, while Andrew placed an order for coffee. When Andrew returned, he set a steaming cup in front of Harold and took a seat across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Harold stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, his gaze fixed on the swirling liquid. Andrew leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. I meant what I said on the plane, Andrew began. I want to hear more about your story. My grandfather spoke about you often, but I never really understood just how much you did for him. Harold glanced up, his expression unreadable. Your grandfather was a good man. He didn't need to make a fuss about me. Andrew shook his head. You saved his life, didn't you? Harold sighed, setting the spoon down. We saved each other's lives out there. That's how it works in war. You don't think about yourself. You think about the man next to you. That's what Richard and I did. Andrew frowned, sensing Harold's reluctance to delve into specifics. But there's more to it, isn't there? He always talked about one particular day, said it changed everything. Harold's hand trembled slightly as he picked up his coffee. He took a long sip before responding, his voice quieter now. There was a day, yes, it was the worst day of my life. Andrew didn't press, giving Harold the space to decide how much he wanted to share. After a long pause, Harold finally continued. It was early 1951, Harold said, his eyes distant. We were deep in enemy territory, cut off from reinforcement. The cold was unbearable and morale was low. Our unit had been tasked with holding a critical position, but it was an impossible mission. We all knew it. Andrew listened intently, his coffee untouched. Richard and I were part of a small squad sent to scout ahead. We stumbled into an ambush, fire from every direction. Half our squad couldn't make it in the first few minutes. The rest of us scrambled for cover, but it was chaos. Richard was hit in the leg and we were pinned down. Harold paused, his grip tightening on his coffee cup. I had a choice, leave him behind and try to escape, or risk my neck to get him out. I didn't think about it, I just acted. I grabbed him and dragged him through enemy fire one step at a time. By some miracle, we made it back to the unit. Andrew's chest tightened as he pictured the scene. And that's how you earned the Distinguished Service Cross? Harold shook his head. No, that came later. Saving Richard was just the start of it. The real fight came when the enemy launched an all-out assault. We were outnumbered 10-1. I took command when our lieutenant lost his life. We held the line for hours, long enough for reinforcements to arrive. That's why they gave me the medal. Not for saving Richard, but for holding that damned hill. Andrew's throat tightened. You make it sound like it was nothing, but it wasn't. You saved lives, my grandfather's included. Harold's gaze hardened. I did what I had to do, but the truth is, I've carried the weight of that day ever since. The men we lost, the things we saw, medals don't erase any of that. Andrew was silent for a moment, letting Harold's words sink in. I think my grandfather understood that, he said finally. He always said the bravest men are the ones who carry the heaviest burdens. Harold gave a faint smile. Richard always had a way with words. Andrew hesitated before speaking again. There's something I need to tell you. He took a deep breath, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I'm not just a passenger, Harold. I'm the owner of the airline, and I'm ashamed of how you were treated today. You deserve better, not just because of what you did for my grandfather, but because of who you are. A man like you should never be made to feel like an inconvenience. Harold's eyes widened in surprise, but before he could respond, Andrew continued. I can't change what happened today, but I can make sure it never happens again. And I can make sure you're honored the way you should be, not just by me, but by everyone who owes their freedom to men like you. Harold looked at Andrew for a long moment, his expression softening. You don't have to do that, son. I didn't do what I did for recognition. I know, Andrew said, but that's exactly why you deserve it. For the first time in what felt like years, Harold's smile reached his eyes. Your grandfather would be proud of you, Andrew, not because of what you have accomplished, but because of the man you have become. Andrew felt a lump form in his throat. Thank you, Harold. That means more to me than you know. As they sat there in the quiet cafe, the weight of the past and the promise of the future seemed to settle between them. Andrew knew this was just the beginning, not just of a friendship, but of a mission to ensure that men like Harold Bennett were never forgotten. And for Harold, it was a reminder that even after all these years, the bonds forged in the heat of battle could still bring light to the darkest of days. The sacrifices and struggles these men and women endured, Andrew thought, they'd never treat them as anything less than heroes. The next morning, Andrew called an emergency meeting with his executive team. As they filed into the boardroom, he could see the curiosity and concern on their faces. Andrew wasted no time. I want to talk about something that happened yesterday, he began, his voice steady but firm. A veteran, a man who served in Korea, who saved lives, who earned the Distinguished Service Cross, was treated like an inconvenience by our staff. He was denied the seat he paid for, shuffled to the back of the plane, and made to feel like a burden. That man's name is Harold Bennett, and he's the reason I'm standing here today. Andrew paused, letting his words sink in. This isn't just about Harold. It's about every veteran who's ever flown with us. It's about how we, as a company, treat the people who've given so much for this country. And it's about making sure this never happens again. He handed out copies of the Honor Flight Initiative, outlining the changes he wanted to implement. The room was silent as the executives read through the proposal. Finally, one of them spoke up. Andrew, this is a great idea, but it's going to cost us. Complimentary upgrades, discounted flights, it's not cheap. Andrew nodded. I know, but this isn't about profit. It's about doing what's right. If we can't honor the people who fought for our freedom, then what are we even doing here? The room fell silent again. But this time, it wasn't out of hesitation, it was out of respect. One by one, the executives nodded their agreement. Over the next few weeks, the Honor Flight Initiative took shape. Andrew personally oversaw the rollout, ensuring every detail was perfect. He even reached out to Harold, inviting him to be the guest of honor at the program's launch event. When the day finally arrived, the airport was buzzing with excitement. Veterans from all branches of the military were in attendance, their uniforms adorned with medals and ribbons. Harold stood at the center of it all, his Distinguished Service Cross gleaming in the light. Andrew took the stage, his heart pounding with pride. Today, we're not just launching a program, he said, his voice carrying through the crowd. We're making a promise to honor, respect, and celebrate the men and women who've served our country. And we're starting with a man who embodies everything this initiative stands for, Harold Bennett. The crowd erupted into applause as Harold stepped forward. For the first time in years, he seemed to stand a little taller, his shoulders a little less burdened. Thank you, Harold said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Not just for this, but for reminding me that what we did mattered, that we're not forgotten. As the event continued, Andrew watched from the sidelines, a sense of fulfillment washing over him. This was just the beginning, he knew. There was still so much work to be done. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. Later that evening, as the crowd began to disperse, Harold approached Andrew. You've done something special here, he said, his eyes shining with pride. Your grandfather would be proud. Andrew smiled. I hope so, and I hope this is just the start. There are so many stories like yours, Harold, stories that deserve to be heard. Harold nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. You're a good man, Andrew. Don't ever lose sight of that. As Harold walked away, Andrew felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about running an airline, it was about making a difference. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing just that. The Honor Flight Initiative was more than a program. It was a promise to remember, to honor, and to never forget. And for Andrew, it was just the beginning. It is to overlook those sacrifices, to treat people like Harold as inconveniences rather than heroes. And that's something we, as an airline, can no longer afford to do. Andrew's gaze swept across the room, landing briefly on Samantha. She felt a jolt of panic, her heart racing as she realized he might know about her role in the incident. A few weeks ago, Andrew continued, his tone firm but not accusatory, Mr. Bennett was denied the seat he paid for. He was told the flight was overbooked, shuffled to the back of the plane, and made to feel like a burden. That's not how we should treat anyone, let alone a man who risked his life for this country. Samantha's hands trembled in her lap. She wanted to speak up, to apologize, but the words caught in her throat. Andrew's voice softened slightly. This isn't about assigning blame. It's about learning from our mistakes and doing better. That's why we're launching the Honor Flight Initiative, a program designed to ensure that every veteran who flies with us is treated with the respect and gratitude they deserve. He went on to outline the program's key features: priority boarding for veterans, complimentary upgrades when available, and a platform for veterans to share their stories. The room buzzed with quiet approval, but Samantha could barely focus. Her mind was consumed by guilt and regret. As the meeting wrapped up, Andrew invited everyone to thank Harold personally. Samantha hung back, unsure of what to do. She watched as her colleagues shook Harold's hand, their expressions filled with admiration and respect. Finally, when the room had mostly cleared, she gathered her courage and approached him. Mr. Bennett, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I was the gate agent who denied your seat that day. I just wanted to say how sorry I am. I had no idea who you were or what you'd been through. I was just following protocol. But that's no excuse. I should have done better. Harold studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then to her surprise, he smiled. It's all right, young lady. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after. Samantha blinked back tears. Thank you for saying that. I promise I'll do better. I'll make sure no one else is treated the way I treated you. Harold nodded. That's all anyone can ask for. As Samantha walked away, she felt a small sense of relief. She knew she couldn't undo what had happened, but she was determined to make amends. Andrew, who had been watching the exchange from across the room, approached Harold. That took courage, Maria said, nodding toward Samantha. Harold chuckled softly. She's not a bad kid, just needed a little reminder of what's important. Andrew smiled. You're a better man than most, Harold. Harold shrugged. I've had a lot of practice forgiving people. Comes with the territory, I suppose. As the event came to a close, Andrew felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The Honor Flight Initiative was more than just a program. It was a promise to do better, to honor the sacrifices of people like Harold, and to ensure that their stories were never forgotten. And for Harold, it was a reminder that even after all these years, his service still mattered, that he was seen, valued, and respected. As they walked out of the conference room together, Andrew turned to Harold. You've inspired a lot of people today, including me. Thank you for sharing your story. Harold smiled, his eyes twinkling with quiet pride. Thank you, Andrew, for giving me the chance to. And with that, the two men walked side by side, their steps echoing through the terminal, a symbol of the past and the future, united by a shared commitment to honor, respect, and gratitude. It takes to the skies, it will carry your legacy, and the legacy of all those who've sacrificed for this country. This is our way of saying thank you, Harold. Thank you for your service, your courage, and for inspiring us to be better. Harold sat in stunned silence, his eyes glistening with tears. For a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. Then slowly he stood, leaning on his cane as the crowd fell silent, waiting for his response. I don't know what to say, Harold began, his voice cracking with emotion. This is more than I ever expected, more than I ever thought I deserved. He paused, taking a deep breath to steady himself. When I came home from the war, I didn't think much about recognition. I just wanted to live my life, to honor the men who didn't make it back. But this isn't just about me. It's about all of us. Every soldier, every veteran who's ever served. You've given us a voice, a place of honor, and for that, I'm deeply grateful. The crowd erupted into applause once more, many wiping away tears as Harold's words resonated through the hangar. Andrew helped Harold to the stage where they stood side by side, the gleaming aircraft behind them serving as a powerful symbol of gratitude and respect. As the ceremony concluded, Harold turned to Andrew, his voice low but filled with sincerity. "You've done something incredible here, son. Your grandfather would be proud." Andrew smiled, his own eyes misty. "I hope so, and I hope this is just the beginning. There's so much more we can do, so many more stories to honor." Harold nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. "You're a good man, Andrew. Don't ever lose sight of that." As the crowd began to disperse, Samantha approached Harold, her expression a mix of nervousness and determination. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes, "I just wanted to say thank you, not just for your service, but for teaching me a lesson I'll never forget. You've changed the way I see people, and I'll always be grateful for that." Harold smiled warmly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You've got a good heart, young lady. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Just keep doing the right thing, and you'll make a difference." Samantha nodded, her resolve strengthened by his words. "I will, I promise." As the day came to a close, Andrew stood at the edge of the hangar, watching as Harold was surrounded by well-wishers and reporters. The sight filled him with a deep sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just about honoring one man. It was about creating a culture of respect and gratitude that would ripple through the airline and beyond. The Honor Flight Initiative was more than a program. It was a promise to remember, to honor, and to never forget. And for Andrew, it was a reminder of the power of one story to inspire change. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the hangar, Andrew felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was just the beginning. There were more stories to tell, more lives to honor, and more work to be done, and he was ready for it. As the plane disappeared into the horizon, Andrew felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The Honor Flight Initiative was more than just a program. It was a movement, a promise to honor the sacrifices of those who had served and to ensure their stories were never forgotten. Harold's legacy would live on, not just in the name emblazoned on the plane, but in the hearts of everyone who had been touched by his story. And for Andrew, it was a reminder of the power of one person to inspire change, to turn mistakes into opportunities, and to create something meaningful out of the past. As he walked back to the terminal, Andrew couldn't help but smile. The journey was far from over, but he knew they were on the right path. Together, they had built something that would endure, a legacy of respect, gratitude, and honor. And for Harold, as he looked out the window of the plane that bore his name, he felt a quiet sense of peace. For the first time in years, he felt truly seen, truly valued. His story, his sacrifices, and his courage had not been in vain. As the plane soared through the clouds, Harold closed his eyes, a faint smile playing on his lips. He was no longer just a veteran, no longer just a man with a cane and a story. He was a symbol, a reminder that every life has value, every story has power, and every act of kindness can change the world. And as the sun set on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the land below, Harold knew that his journey, and the journey of so many others like him, would continue to inspire, to uplift, and to remind the world of the power of honor, respect, and gratitude. The plane carrying Harold's name flew on, a beacon of hope and a testament to the enduring spirit of those who had given so much. And as it disappeared into the distance, it left behind a legacy that would never fade, a legacy of courage, of change, and of the unbreakable bond between those who serve and those who honor them.